As it is known, Panama Paper was one of the biggest leaks on tax avoidance. How did the British government react after this scandal?
So it played out interestingly in the UK. It was one of the places where there was most pressure, I would say, politically, partly because the government had already positioned itself at the 2013 G8 summit that the UK hosted as a leader on the kind of financial and tax transparency that the Panama Papers really makes the case for. So they had, in a sense, a following wind that they had to continue with that agenda. But you also had the issue that David Cameron, the Prime Minister then, his own father was named in the papers, and it brought back what was already known but at a higher profile about the way that his father had made money using offshore investment structures and marketing them to others. So all in all, there was a great deal of pressure for the UK to be seen to react in a positive way, both by tightening up things here, but also by looking at, you know, who were the big jurisdictions in the Panama Papers, because it wasn't Panama. By and large, it was British jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, where you saw a lot of these anonymous companies actually being created by the Panamanian lawyers. So I think you saw the UK feel that it had to deliver something around the transparency of the ownership of companies, and the UK certainly did that here. There's now a public register, but also looking at the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, and that's where things didn't really happen as fast as people wanted.
Were there substantial changes in financial regulation to tackle tax avoidance and tax evasion? How did the British government react on this?
So the biggest delivery, if you like, the real concrete thing that happened, something that had already been in motion was delivered, which was the UK introducing a public register of the beneficial owners of companies. So in theory, for the main company types here, it's now impossible to own a UK company without your name being in the public domain, which was, you know, what was being sold in the Panama Papers largely was anonymous company ownership that was then seen to have been used in all sorts of corruption cases, tax evasion, political conflicts of interest, and so on. However, we also saw a process that was derailed by the Brexit vote, the stepping down of David Cameron, the change of government, to a government that had other things to think about than the Panama Papers, and basically refused, when it came to it, to require that same degree of transparency from the overseas territories like the Cayman Islands and from the Crown dependencies like Jersey. So they've left a very big gap there in terms of the type of tax transparency that's available.
In the last budget that they have approved, the British government has announced that they will legislate over 35 new measures to tackle avoidance, evasion and aggressive tax planning, such as further action to stop businesses from converting capital losses into trading losses, tackle abuse of foreign pension schemes, and also a financial penalty for professionals who enable tax avoidance agreements. Are these the most effective measures to fight tax avoiders?
So look, some of these measures in the Criminal Finances Bill are very important. Certainly starting to look at the professional enablers of evasion is a significant step. We very often see the little guy who bought a scheme being prosecuted, but not the scheme seller. And if you trap those guys, then you start to have a systemic impact. So that's definitely progress. I think there are two concerns, though, with what's being done. The first is that there just isn't the enforcement capacity to actually go after this. It's not clear that it will be possible in practice actually to prosecute any of the professional enablers. Not clear the government's actually willing to resource anyone to go after people who might falsely declare the beneficial ownership of companies. At the moment, UK Companies House technologically is world leading, but in terms of capacity to resource it is world trailing. You know, we are far behind in terms of our ability to actually enforce the regulation on the books. And I think the other big issue is really whether the UK's position on that transparency agenda is consistent with seeking to potentially position itself as the lowest corporate tax rate country among the major economic powers.
Mentioning this point, the recent report revealed or leak from a Labour Party proves that this party is planning to increase the corporate tax if they win the election. In the other side, we have the Conservatives who were planning to lower the taxes or to turn the UK into a tax haven. So we see a huge division between the two major parties in the UK. Is this the right moment for the British citizens to decide what type of country they want to have in the future? Whether they want to have a tax haven or they want to have a country that has high taxes but high standards?
Here's the thing. This is probably the most divided UK election for 20 years on the question of tax. You have a party in power that's taken the corporate tax rate down from 28% towards, well, they're now talking about 15%, trying, using this rhetoric of having the most competitive tax rate, which means very little other than effectively giving away a bit more than £2 billion for every percentage point that you take off. And their own analysis shows there hasn't been, and there is not expected to be, any increase in investment. So this is a straight giveaway to the owners of multinational companies, largely. And now we have the election, the Labour Party and also I think the Liberal Democrats are proposing a return to a much higher rate. Still probably a significantly lower rate than a lot of other large economies, but nonetheless above 25%. So we'll see very clearly whether people are interested in voting for, potentially 10, 20 billion pounds a year of revenue to spend on public services, or they believe in the ideological dogma of tax competition, even despite the evidence or the lack of evidence. But I think, unfortunately, the election will be dominated by Brexit decisions, or at least a sense of who will lead the negotiations. And it may be that this tax question, even though it is so sharply divided, is just not at the top of people's minds when they take that voting decision.
And related to Brexit, you have raised concerns about the recent threats of British Prime Minister Theresa May, who have said that they can change the model of the economy into a tax haven if there will be a hard Brexit. Though the negotiations have not yet started, but we don't know what will happen. So my question would be how the UK economy will benefit from becoming a tax haven, and what are the consequences of becoming a tax haven?
This is, of the many, many crazy things that have been said during the UK's discussion about its position on Brexit, this is probably the craziest. There's, there is a tax haven model that works to a degree for very small economies, very small jurisdictions, where you only need to capture a little bit of the kind of dirty business going around the world or of the potential profit shifting of multinationals for your citizens to reach a higher standard of living. Now, at the extreme, you see that in Luxembourg and Switzerland, both of which have very diversified financial secrecy models. So they're taking slightly dirty money in a lot of different areas. The UK really has farmed out its financial secrecy to the overseas territories, to the Crown dependencies. We haven't so much done it here. We've said we are transparent and well governed, and that dirty money is somewhere else. And we haven't really gone for profit shifting. We get a bit of it, but we also lose a bit. So it's about a wash for the UK. So the question is, are we in a position where we could actually attract sufficient volume of additional dirty money to make up for the loss in economic standard of living that we're almost certainly going to experience by leaving the European Union and the single market? And the answer is categorically no. There's no chance. So this was put up there as a threat to try to get a better deal. We will do this nasty thing to the EU if they don't give us a good deal. And actually, even on those terms, it doesn't work. The EU is in a position where they can require all sorts of regulation of UK financial services in order for them to have access to the European market. where they can refuse to do business with us if we don't have appropriate transparency of our company structures, if we don't exchange information about bank accounts, for example, which we currently do. And it would be a terrible step backwards to lose that. But in any case, they could just cut us off, so we wouldn't benefit. We'd lose again. Finally, we could go for attracting all the profit shifting that Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands are currently attracting from other member states. This very anti-social behaviour to try and get profit shifting into the UK. But again, we're a much bigger economy with a lot more people. For that to be a viable business model for the UK, we'd really have to go very far. And we know that all of those jurisdictions have not the statutory rate, but the effective tax rate, at least for US multinationals where we have the data, is between 0 and 1%. So for the UK to get into that game, to be able to compete, we'd have to give away almost all of the revenue that we're currently getting in order to take this very small portion of a bigger share of world profit that isn't ours. So I think we'd lose money, I think we'd lose friends for sure, and we'd end up in the same position tax havens always end up, which is with higher inequality and greater corruption, because your political system has been kind of sold to the dirty money game. It's all downside, literally. The question, though, as we discussed, is whether the UK might just vote for that anyway.
Mm-hmm. And the other issue is that the UK is bigger than other tax havens that already exist. So there are smaller countries, so their damage is smaller than the UK would.
Right. Yeah, the potential global impact on, for example, on developing countries of the UK really going hard for this route could be quite large, even at the same time as the UK itself would lose out.
Mm-hmm. Another thing is that starting from this year and expanding in 2018, there will be automatic multilateral exchange of financial information for more than 100 jurisdictions, and the major financial centers will be included except the United States. So could you tell us more the importance of this policy and the role of the UK on it?
Sure. So that when the Tax Justice Network was set up in 2003, we created a policy platform, the ABC of tax transparency, A being automatic exchange of tax information. That's because at that time you had exchange of information on request. So the UK might go to Switzerland and say, we'd like to have information about this person's bank account. And Switzerland would say, possibly, okay, here's the information, or they'd say, well, actually, no, you need to tell us more detail. This is a fishing trip. We're not willing to tell you if such a bank account exists yet. And often you wouldn't get any information exchange. What the Panama Papers have shown, and other leaks before that, is that unless that information is being automatically provided to the person's tax authority, there's really no incentive not to evade your taxes. Right? You need to know that information's coming for you to declare it to your own tax authority. So this is, having this multilateral deal, as you say, more than 100 jurisdictions, basically all the big players except the United States. It's a really big step forward. It's expanding, in effect, a European deal to include many more secrecy jurisdictions, and we hope over time to start including developing countries so they get the benefits of this too. It's a really powerful measure against corruption, because it says if you don't declare this at home, somebody else will tell us about it. And that's the biggest incentive for compliance you can have, the idea that the information is going to come anyway. The problem with the UK's threat of tax havenery is that they'd be stepping back from that if that's really what they wanted to do, if they wanted to have secret bank accounts once again, for example. And swimming against the tide in that way would mark the UK so clearly as looking for dirty money that I think it would be very difficult to actually make it a viable business model for the UK. And the problem, even if you thought you could make that work, is that the US is well established already. In fact, the US is rapidly becoming the biggest tax haven, certainly the biggest threat to financial transparency in the world. The UK can't compete with that, even if it was a good idea, which it's not.
And how it would affect also the image of the UK.
Right. I mean, the one thing the US has managed to do is sort of slowly be turning itself into a tax haven without quite getting the reputation.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk to people in the Cayman Islands, in Jersey, in Switzerland, people who are involved in good business, if you like, whether that's banking, company services, accounting, other professional services, they'll tell you the biggest threat to their livelihood is the reputation that those jurisdictions have for being dirty. Now, the UK may have a lot of dirty money coming through London property, for example, or coming from the network of overseas territories and crown dependencies into the city. But by and large, the city is seen as relatively well-governed, well-regulated, not completely opaque, not completely dirty. The potential damage, the reputational damage of the UK going full tax haven to that good, clean business is very large indeed. And it's one more reason why, along with Brexit, you could see that kind of tax haven strategy force a lot of that good business into Germany, into France, into other EU member states, again making the outcome for the UK even worse than it's likely to be anyway.
Mr. Cobham, these are my questions. If you have to add anything related to this topic, go ahead.
I would say, just going back to the point about the election, although Brexit is going to dominate, we are at a tipping point in the UK, and it may be that in 5-10 years' time, we've dug ourselves into a hole of low taxes, of poor public services, of a weaker administration, worse governance, perhaps higher corruption. Or we may have taken this opportunity to say, no, we don't want to go that way. Have a look at what Sweden's doing today, where you see higher taxes and higher growth and lower inequality going hand in hand. They're really pushing back against this race to the bottom. The UK, even outside the EU, has an opportunity. We'll see whether the country takes it.